12:14 a.m., the night of October 29th, 1927. The Hawthorne Smokehouse on Cermak Avenue was still thick with cigarette smoke and jazz music, but no one paid attention to Frankie Two Toes Martelli as he walked in, collar pulled high, eyes fixed on the familiar back at the corner of the bar. Al Capone was sitting there, his fedora hat placed on the table, whiskey glass untouched, more vulnerable than ever. Frankie swallowed hard, his sweaty palm gripping the Colt .38 in his coat pocket. $75,000 from the North Side gang was waiting for him, along with the promise that his family would survive. He advanced step by step, silent as a ghost, until he was right behind Capone. 2 feet, 1 foot, the gun pressed against the back of the boss's head. Frankie pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. The small sound should have been drowned out by the music, but it echoed like a hammer blow on the Chicago underworld. The packed bar froze in a single breath. The music stopped. Glasses hung in patrons' hands. Capone didn't panic. He just tilted his head slightly and turned around, his deep black eyes staring straight at Frankie. The boss spoke slowly, each word like a knife slicing through the air. "You picked the wrong night to try your luck, Frankie." Chicago in 1927 was stretched tight like a wire. Prohibition had turned every neighborhood from the South Side to Cicero into slices of power. Where bootleg liquor went, guns followed. Capone held Cicero in his grip, locking down the supply routes from Canada and pushing the North Side gang into losing millions of dollars in just a few months. After the deaths of O'Banion and then Weiss, Bugs Moran understood one thing: if he didn't retaliate, his gang would disappear from the Chicago map. One evening, near Lincoln Park, Moran called his men to an old warehouse. No beating around the bush, just one short order: Capone has to die. But getting close to Capone was another story. He was always protected, always surrounded by his own people, always one step ahead of his enemies' moves. To kill Capone, they needed someone on the inside. One name came up immediately: Frankie Martelli, the man who had saved Capone from an ambush in 1924. The man Capone trusted completely. The man who could walk into any of Capone's bars without a single question. Moran knew it well. Only Frankie could open the door for 15 men carrying orders to kill Capone as they entered the Hawthorne Smokehouse that night. Frankie was the only weakness Moran believed he could exploit, and in the end, Moran targeted Frankie. 10 days before that night, Frankie Martelli left an underground gambling den on Belmont Avenue. The alley behind the building was dark and damp, but he immediately recognized the figure waiting for him. Bugs Moran. No bodyguards, no greeting. Moran just looked at Frankie, as if he had belonged to the other side for a long time. Frankie knew why he had been summoned, but he stood still, silent. Moran got straight to the point. The doctor had reported that the hospital bills for Frankie's son had exceeded what any working man could afford. The illness was getting worse day by day. Without money, the boy wouldn't make it through the winter. Frankie listened to every word, his insides twisting. But that wasn't all. Gambling debts to the Irish side were backing Frankie into a corner, and the debt collectors weren't known for their patience. Moran mentioned every detail as if reading from a ledger, then placed a thick envelope in Frankie's hand. $75,000, along with a promise his family would be protected. No one would dare touch them. In exchange, just one thing, one bullet. Moran spoke slowly, without emphasis, but the words fell straight into Frankie's chest. One bullet, one moment, a new life. Frankie was silent for a long time. Capone had pulled him from the bottom of the streets to the doorstep of power. Capone had trusted him when no one else did. Frankie owed the boss more than he could ever repay. But the image of his son, gasping for breath in the hospital room, kept surfacing. Both things were true, and both couldn't coexist. Moran didn't pressure him. He just added one more sentence. Capone won't give you a future. I will. Then he walked away, leaving Frankie standing alone in the alley. That night, Frankie didn't sleep. He counted the money again, replayed Moran's words, then thought about Capone, the man he had risked his life to save 4 years earlier. 3 days passed, each one feeling like a year, until the morning of the third day. Frankie called the number Moran had given him, just 3 words. I agree. From that moment, everything moved fast. Moran selected 15 men, 7 reckless Irish gunmen, and 8 from the North Side gang. They were fully armed, from pistols to Thompson SMGs, hidden in empty beer crates in an abandoned warehouse on Clark Street. Moran met them one last time, pointing to Frankie he would clear the way, lead them into the Hawthorne Smokehouse at the exact time and position. It had to end in 30 seconds. Throughout the meeting, Frankie said nothing. He just stared down at his hands, the hands that had once been loyal to Capone without a single crack. But now, between loyalty and his son's life, he had chosen, or he thought he had chosen. Because on the night of October 29th, he still didn't know that Capone had been one step ahead, and even his betrayal was part of the boss's plan. 6 days earlier, while he was still torn between loyalty and despair, the plot to kill Capone had leaked. A police officer from the Cermak Avenue district, who had been on Capone's payroll for years, overheard a conversation between 2 North Side men at a night watch post. They mentioned exactly 3 things Capone never ignored: the name Frankie Martelli, Hawthorne Smokehouse, and the night of October 29th. Just those 3 details were enough for the officer to immediately pick up the phone and call Capone's men in Cicero. In Chicago back then, even a whisper of wind could signal an approaching storm. The information reached Capone within an hour. Outsiders thought Capone was hot-tempered and impulsive, but those who knew him understood. Capone never reacted on instinct. He observed. He calculated. He waited for the right moment, and the second he heard Frankie's name, Capone just went quiet for a beat. Not out of surprise, but because he recognized what everyone else denied. Even the most loyal people have a breaking point when family is threatened. Capone didn't order Frankie dragged into a back room. No interrogation, he just waved his hand. Leave him alone, because Capone understood something Moran didn't. If you want to take down a lamp, let it burn brightest before snuffing it out. Frankie had to believe Capone knew nothing. Frankie had to believe he could get close to Capone easily. Frankie had to lead those 15 men right into the place Capone had prepared. And that place was the Hawthorne Smokehouse, a bar that seemed ordinary, but in Capone's hands could become a more discreet battlefield than any street in Chicago. 3 days before the fateful evening, Capone quietly had the entire interior layout changed. The attic was cleared and positioned with 3 expert marksmen, each with a direct line of sight down to the main room through ventilation slits. The back of the bar, where there was once an emergency exit leading to a narrow alley, was welded shut by Capone's orders, with a new steel plate added and painted over so no one would notice. The basement escape route was blocked with wooden beams and 2 new locks. Regular patrons were told there's a private party that night, meaning only Capone's people were allowed inside. But the most important change was the one-way mirror installed behind the bar counter. From the outside, it looked like an old, foggy mirror, but from the inside, where Capone positioned 6 of his men, Everything in the bar was clearly visible. Every movement. No one knew Capone had turned Hawthorne into a sealed box, where anyone who entered couldn't leave unless he allowed it. When preparations were complete, Capone said just one thing: "Don't touch Frankie. Let him bring them in himself." The man beside him, Johnny Torrio, the old mentor, looked at Capone and immediately understood this wasn't just about revenge. This was about sending a message written in fear. To ensure Frankie believed Capone was vulnerable, that night Capone deliberately arrived earlier than usual, sitting alone at his usual table, without any bodyguards. He even asked for the music to be turned up a bit louder, as if he really wanted to relax. On the surface, it was Capone's most vulnerable moment, but beneath that facade was an entire steel trap waiting to close. 12:10 a.m., October 29th. Frankie Martelli went in first, coat pulled tight, shoulders slightly trembling, but step steady, as if he had rehearsed it 1,000 times. Behind him were 7 Irish gunmen with fiery red hair, and the remaining 8 from the North Side gang, faces more familiar with Thompson guns than daylight. No one spoke. Each knew they were about to do something that would make all of Chicago feverish when the news broke. Kill Al Capone right in his own territory. The Hawthorne Smokehouse appeared under the streetlights, its sign shimmering as if it were just an ordinary bar waiting for customers. No one knew that inside, Capone had turned it into a steel trap. Frankie touched the door handle, took a deep breath. He had opened this door hundreds of times, but never had his hand felt this heavy. When the door swung open, warm air and fading music spilled out. Inside, the bar wasn't as crowded as on a typical weekend night. Something Frankie didn't notice, because Capone had cleared out all outsiders early. At the usual table, Capone sat alone, back slightly turned, fedora hat beside the whiskey glass, still full of ice. The boss looked like he had just come from a meeting and wanted a few quiet minutes to himself, a perfect image for making a move. Frankie swallowed hard. He knew every position in the bar, every safe step to approach without alerting Capone. He moved forward, slowly but surely, 7 steps, then 5, then 3. The 15 men behind him spread out as planned. Some pressed close to the bar, some stood near the door, the rest scattered around the room, hands hidden in their coats. Everything went so smoothly that if Moran had been there, he would have smiled in satisfaction. Frankie stood behind Capone. In this moment, his heart was no longer that of a traitor, but that of a father. He gripped the gun tightly. The gun whose firing pin Capone had replaced 3 days earlier. He raised it, aiming at the back of Capone's head. No one in the bar noticed. That's what made the plan perfect. Frankie squeezed the trigger. Click, just a small sound. But in the space of the Hawthorne Smokehouse, that sound tore through the veil of disguise. Frankie heard it echo in his skull, like a verdict. He pulled the trigger again. Click. A third time. Click. Nothing. And then, as if an invisible hand had turned off all sound in the world, the crowded bar suddenly went dead silent. The saxophone stopped mid-note. The clinking of glasses ceased. Only Frankie stood there, hand shaking, useless gun pointed at the head of the most dangerous man in Chicago. Capone didn't jump up, didn't shout, didn't draw a weapon. He just set his whiskey glass down gently, slowly turned his head. Little by little, his black eyes looked straight at Frankie, not angry, not surprised, just certain, as if he had foreseen this moment months ago. So that's it, Frankie. His voice was low, steady, like talking to a friend who was late, rather than someone who had just tried to kill him. I've been waiting for this moment all week. Frankie froze, lips trembling violently. Before he could say a word, the 15 men behind him drew their guns in unison. Thompsons flashed under the lights. A few patrons screamed. Some threw chairs and ran toward the door, but Capone just raised one hand, not high, shoulder level, a barely noticeable nod, and what happened next froze everyone. The entire bar stood still. The people who seemed like customers were all Capone's men, waiting for exactly this signal. One nod, and then the lights went out. The whole place plunged into pitch blackness. The assassin's footsteps echoed chaotically in the room. Frankie shouted, "Run! Get out!" But it was too late. A voice rang out from somewhere in the darkness, deeper, colder than Capone's usual tone, as if echoing from the deepest basement of Chicago. "Now it's my turn." And right after that, the attic opened fire. Bursts from 3 machine guns whistled down through the ventilation slits. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark. Strobe lights, illuminating faces contorted in fear. An Irishman collapsed right at Frankie's feet, blood splattering his coat. 2 North Side men tried to shoot back, but only fired into the darkness. Their bullets ricocheted off the steel walls Capone had installed earlier, hitting no one. Another ran toward the back exit, but when he got there, the door was sealed tight. He screamed, pounding the steel until his hands bled, but the door didn't budge. 2 more looked for the basement route, but they didn't know Capone had blocked it with beams. They were herded together like animals in a cage, eyes desperate as they heard the guns above roar again. One tried to throw a grenade into the corner, but he was shot down before pulling the pin. Screams, groans, bullets clashing blended into a symphony of death. Each minute felt like an hour. The Hawthorne Smokehouse was no longer a bar. It was a sealed battlefield. One by one they fell. Some tried to crawl under tables. Some desperately charged the front door. Only one, an Irishman with a scarred face, dodged the bursts and charged straight out the main door. He kicked it open, burst outside like a man who had seen the way out of hell. He ran 3 steps. A shot rang out from the darkness of the adjacent alley. He collapsed right under the Hawthorne Smokehouse sign, the only one to leave the bar that night, and he didn't live to tell anything. Inside, the gunfire stopped. Only Frankie's gasping breaths remained. He knelt amid the wreckage, still holding the useless gun. Capone walked over, steps slow as if strolling through a park rather than a massacre scene. He looked around at the bodies scattered across the room, then at Frankie, the traitor who was still alive. "I told you, don't kill ants one by one." He placed a hand on Frankie's shoulder, whether out of pity or marking him, no one knew. "You burn the whole nest," and the Hawthorne Smokehouse on the night of October 29th became the night Chicago understood one thing: no one could touch Capone. When the gunfire died down, when the smell of gunpowder hadn't even faded, the news began to leak out. 1 hour, 2 hours, then by dawn, all of Chicago was whispering the same question: where did the 15 men go? No one saw them leave the bar. No one heard an explanation. Only one body lay under the Hawthorne sign, the other 14, as if they had vanished from the earth. In the underworld, nothing spreads faster than fear. And that night, fear took the shape of Al Capone. The news reached Bugs Moran near noon the next day. He didn't shout, didn't smash the table, didn't curse as usual. He just gripped his cigarette until the ash crumbled to the floor, eyes blank, as he realized he had misjudged Capone from the start. He had sent his 15 best men and got back exactly 1 corpse. Losing 15 men in one night wasn't defeat. It was a declaration of war. But Moran knew he had no way to respond. The North Side gang, once proud to be Capone's only rival, began to crack like broken glass. Some fled to Wisconsin, some joined smaller groups, the rest tried to stay silent, hoping Capone would forget their names. But Capone didn't need to remember. One night was enough for every other power to understand the message. Chicago wasn't Moran's playground. Chicago was Capone's territory. The police got wind of it, but everyone pretended not to hear. The officers knew Capone had bought nearly half the precinct, and the rest were too afraid to dig for the truth. The incident was filed as an armed brawl and shelved. No newspaper dared run the headline. No reporter dared visit the scene. The Hawthorne Smokehouse closed for 2 days, then reopened as if blood had never stained the floor. 2 nights later, Capone met his men in the back room of the bar, where the dim light cast his shadow on the wall like a king without a throne, but with more power than any throne. He poured whiskey, looked at each face in front of him, those who had witnessed the entire night of October 29th, and spoke in a low, calm voice, but sharp as a verdict. In this city, power isn't measured by the number of bullets, it's measured by certainty. And last night, I showed Chicago who holds that certainty. No one replied. No one needed to. Everyone understood. Capone wasn't talking about the fight. He was talking about the new order in Chicago. The order he had just rewritten with flashes of gunfire and absolute silence. From that night on, the Hawthorne Smokehouse was no longer just a bar in Cicero. It became a legend in Illinois. People retold it in the shadows of gambling dens, in the basements of speakeasies, behind bootleg breweries, in stories no newspaper dared print. They talked about 15 men who entered the bar, and only one who walked out, but he didn't live to tell the rest. They talked about how Capone didn't just survive every war in Chicago, but turned the board to his will. And they ended with a sentence the entire underworld nodded in agreement to. Al Capone didn't just go through Chicago's wars, he defined them.